live. Day 5 of my 30-day video challenge. Today, we are going to talk about time. Time. Time is interesting because there are a lot of things that, when you travel or just have an interest in different cultures, you look at in one culture they do it this way, and in another culture they do it that way. And of course there's food and music and all the various things that make up cultures. With most of those, I think we're generally aware of the idea that there's multiple perspectives. Like food is a good example. Even if you only eat Jamaican food, you're still probably aware that there's other food out there, and that what you eat is what you eat, especially in this day and age, in like a global world where you have the internet and even media, newspapers, whatever, access to information. You realize that there's more than just what you're used to. There's normal for you, but there's other stuff out there, whether you like it or not, or whether you take part in it or not. Time and our perspective on time is kind of another one of those things, except that I think most of us don't realize that our cultural perspective on it is just one perspective on it, and that there are many other ones. I was reading something this morning talking about philosophy and how mostly we focus on Western philosophy and sort of ignore the other ones, and it got into time as part of that and how it differs. And it reminded me of this topic and of a book that I read a few years ago called The Time Paradox, which was written by Professor Philip Zimbardo, who you may, if that name sounds familiar, you may remember him from the Stanford Prison Experiment, which was one of those like extremely controversial psychology or sociology experiments, along with the Milgram experiment that gets taught these days as both very interesting for what it revealed about people, but also an example of why you need ethics rules and things like that, and especially working with students, but anybody, when doing those kinds of social experiments. Anyway, so Zimbardo and Boyd wrote this book, The Time Paradox, and in it they do a pretty great survey of the different attitudes that one can have towards time, and they even developed I think they call it a time preference inventory, something like that. It's basically a questionnaire that you can do that asks you kind of things like, I remember the past fondly, or I often think about the future and how it will be, or I'm fearful of what the future holds for me, all kinds of things like that you answer. And from that, they give you sort of a score in different areas. Are you past positive or present hedonistic? And there's a whole series of them that they come up with. But it's interesting to see on a personal level how you kind of relate to time and what you think about it. But I think it's also, and of course these are generalizations, but it's also interesting to look at cultures as a whole. And again, because I think, unlike a lot of other cultural issues, we don't see our own inherent kind of cultural biases when it comes to time perspective. So for example, as an American, we always say time is money. It's a cliche, but it is in many ways kind of the way that we consider time. It's very normal for us to take our yearly salary and sort of divide it by 2,000, thinking that there's roughly 40 working hours in a week and roughly 50 working weeks in a year. So you take your salary, you divide it by 2,000. So if you make $50,000 a year, that's $25 an hour, and you sort of have that number in your head as your hourly rate. And so if someone offers to clean your house for $18 an hour, the kind of math that we have is, $18 an hour, that's lower than my hourly rate. Therefore, if I don't like cleaning, I'm better off working an extra hour, assuming there's some elasticity in your ability to work, but I'm better off working an extra hour than I am cleaning my own house. And again, there's a lot of assumptions in there, but just that type of thinking is very American. to me, that's just sort of a normal way to think. I don't think of it as being like, my American perspective on time, but it is. The Western view of time in general is also very linear, and this is especially American also, but I think it's true in a lot of Western perspective, that we're sort of constantly moving forward and getting better is sort of the implication of that. And that, again, that seems so natural. For me, just to think of it any other way seems very awkward. But it's certainly not the only perspective, nor is it even maybe a natural perspective as opposed to something that needs to be taught. Eastern philosophies, and again, I'm generalizing, are much more cyclical in the view of time. And you think of people, right? You're born, you're sort of this weak, very dependent creature, and then you get stronger and you get stronger, and then you have, your adulthood, and there's this kind of like long period where you have a certain strength and ability to earn and maybe care for a family or have children, and then you sort of get older and you start to lose those abilities until you get old enough, and then you die. But the next generation repeats the cycle. And if you think of nature going through the seasons, think of a tree or some kind of plant that goes from sapling through all the stages over a life cycle, but also throughout the season going from winter to spring to summer to fall back to winter again. So it's time moves in these circles, right? So not America started and then got better and now it's really great and it'll only get more great in the future, as we were taught. But maybe China was great once and it got even better, and then it kind of peaked and then it went down and then it'll rise again, and it's just this like history repeats itself. You can apply that type of thinking to lots of different things, but again, the part that I find fascinating is just that we're so often unaware that our perspective on time is only one perspective on time, and that there are other ways of looking at it. Continuing on the idea of the seasons, I think there's something else there that's really interesting in the way that affects us. I've never done any research on this myself. I'm sure some people have. I'm certainly not an expert. But one thing I've noticed, generalizing again, is that the cultures that you associate with being really sort of like productive and very work-oriented, the so-called Protestant work ethic, maybe there's a religious tie-in there, but I think there's also a weather tie-in. If you look at a place like, say, Finland, they have brutally cold winters. And if you didn't figure out pretty early on that, you need to plant in the spring, nurture your crops in the summer, whatever, and then harvest in the fall, and at the same time, collect wood and other supplies and really prepare for winter, that whole, winter is coming, build strong houses, do all of that type of stuff, all of which requires planning. It's not living in the moment. It's not, let's just do something for today. It's all kind of like, I better prepare for tomorrow. If you don't do that stuff and then winter comes, you die. You die, or, maybe you borrow from someone else. Community is important. But that sort of planning is rewarded, or in other words, lack of planning is punished. But if you look at cultures places like, say, Thailand, it might not be pleasant, to have to sleep outside, and maybe you run into, a problem with, a snake or a spider or something. So it's not that there's no danger, but there isn't this sense of a 3-month or 6-month, depending on where you are, say in Siberia, period, where if you don't have a place to sleep and food stored up, you're definitely going to die. In somewhere like Thailand or any other tropical place, again, it might be uncomfortable, it might not be totally safe, but there is sort of a sense of you can pick a mango off a tree and just eat it, and now you have enough food for today. And you could do the same thing tomorrow. And there isn't that same need to always be planning for the future in order to survive. I think that plays a role. I think there's something there that has, even though now we live in like a modern society where people have houses and heating and air conditioning and grocery stores, and I'm not literally like building a shelter for the winter every year and going out and collecting firewood for anything other than novelty, right? I'm not doing it in order to survive. But I think in cultures in certain countries, that you got to plan for the future attitude has just become baked into the culture. And those are the countries that tend to be the ones that we think of as being very productive, but also the ones where you probably have, more people that are stressed out, that have anxiety, because anxiety is a fear of what might happen in the future. You're not anxious about the present. It's not a present state condition. It's like I'm thinking about, something that might happen, that might go wrong, some possible future scenario, and worrying about it now. And again, that means that like you're mentally already in the future, which can be beneficial, but also has those conditions associated with it. And I would guess if you look at other tropical countries where they haven't had that sort of thinking baked into the culture as much, of course it's present now. I mean, you can find, big companies and consulting firms and all this kind of stuff and universities in, any tropical country you would go to. It's still just not as much a part of the culture to be constantly forward thinking and worrying about tomorrow and all of that. And I would suspect that you would find less anxiety and stress and related things like that. And of course, you just think of it, we're on island time. What are all the various cliches around that, right? That just those places tend to be more relaxed. Of course, the weather is part of it, but I'm thinking like the weather over the long term and how it's affected the culture. Anyway, that's all for today on Time. See you tomorrow.